Hi, welcome back to another deep dive with Colin. Today we are going to be talking about puff, and not just how to do a basic puff, but how to do something that's a little bit more interesting and a little bit more engaging. We're going to do some dimensional puff. In this design, I have solid areas that have got some good doming, but then I've got areas that are actually that have puffed a little bit less than the rest of it. And that is due to halftoning effect. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. The reason why I'm playing with puff is because we have a 20th anniversary event coming up on August 8th. And I wanted to do something that was visually engaging, where screen printers can come in and go, that's cool, that's neat, how do I do that? But I wanted to do it as simply as I could. So in this case, it's just 2 screens. So I took a AI generated Mayan calendar. It was something that I thought was fun and neat to look at, had a lot of great elements. And it had, of course, really good grayscale foundation. So it's got darks and it's got lights, which will create that nice contrast. So in that, what I was able to do was I was able to create a knockout of what could have been just a solid puff circle that would not have been very engaging to actually look at. It would have just been a nice grayscale print on top of a solid circle. But this one, when you catch it at the side, you can see that there's areas that actually dome up, and then areas right next to it where, because we're dealing with a lower percentage, a lower halftone, 20, 30, 40% dot, that it doesn't raise up quite as much. So it gives you dimensional texture. And we're going to walk through what that looks like when I print it. Now, what I've done is now for my screens, what I've done is the standard approach for what you want to do with puff, which is creating a thicker stencil. You can get away with a standard coated screen, and you can get a good puff out of it. But if you've watched any of the older videos we did, like when we released the FN puff, we talk about levers that you can pull. We're talking about the amount of puff additive that you're putting in your ink and how thick your ink deposit is. If you go full on both levers, maximum amount of puff additive and a big deposit, you get a big doming amount of puff. If you put just a little bit of puff in there and a lot of ink, then you get something that looks closer to high density. It goes more straight up. Sorry about the background noises. We got production going on downstairs. So again, we've got those 2 levers. So when puff activates, you've got this, single layer of ink, and then the puff expands, causing a doming effect. So that's how you get puff. Instead of it being a flat straight up, it causes a little bit of a doming. And the shirt that's right here will pucker up along with it. We'll get you a good shot of what that looks like. So again, a good puff is also about distorting the shirt. So we're going to talk about a lightweight shirt and a heavyweight shirt and how that affects what the print looks like. But let's dive in and start printing. So what I want to do is I want to get a black background on my print. So when I print my puff, I'm going to have dimension that I then need to print my black around, and you'll see that when I come back to it. So I need to create a foundation for some of that background color. And I'll show you here in just a second. So I'm using a 65, 90, 65 durometer squeegee for my puff. I want to get a nice heavy ink deposit, but I want to be able to control it. And this is what that print looks like. We can see that we've got the background there, but if I was to try and print black around it, I've got to get that screen, my 305 mesh that the black is on, to go past and, to try and reach underneath these valleys and crevices in this puff, or in the puff print. And once I flash it, you're going to see just a small amount of activation, and that'll be demonstrated a little bit more. So let's flash this. Now with cold platins, it does take longer to flash, no matter what's going on. And it's actually a very good thing because in this case, I want to control the amount of heat as I don't want to activate the puff as much as possible. I want it to remain as pristine as possible. I can place my hand all over the print. There's a very small amount of tack, but if I put on my glasses to take a look at the print, I can see that we've definitely got some dimension going on. There's a very tiny, tiny amount of puff that happens regardless of whether you want it to or not. So when I print my black on top of this, I'm gonna have all this dimension. You know, think of trying to print through the Grand Canyon as an example. So having my black down early in my print sequence is gonna help to fill in a lot of those shadows, and I can control on I can focus on just controlling my print on top of this. So I'm using a 75-90-75 squeegee. Oh no! Oh, that was weird. It felt like it stuck. So we can see that my print now, it looks a little dark and a little saturated, but when the ink itself puffs, it's going to expand that black a little bit, lightening it out. Let's run it through the dryer and check it out. So you can see two things here. One, the black ink that looked really dark and overshadowed when I pulled that squeegee is now a lot lighter. That is directly related to the puff expanding and as a result thinning out the black that's there on top and giving it giving what we see as a better shadow control. All the darks that I had laid down when I first printed my black is there controlling a lot of that shadow detail. And then the puff that was in here has now risen up just a little bit. You can see in these areas that are right next to some hard edges, some hard lines, we're getting some dimensionality out of all of that. Now let's talk about the screens that I'm using. On this one specifically, I'm using a 158 thin thread, but I was able to coat this rather thickly. I'm using Chroma Blue, which has that 50% solids that we talked about last time. The solids content of your emulsion directly affects how thick and your stencil development is. Using the Chroma Blue, I'm able to get a really thick stencil really quick. This screen specifically was a 1 and 3 coat using that Monster Max scoop coater. And I was able to get, again, we're talking in the microns and reference 170 microns on this stencil, which is about what I get when I'm looking for a thick stencil out of a 110. So a 110 or a 158 is going to work great for what we're seeing here, but I wanted to push that level a little bit because I have a Spider 2 downstairs, a wax direct-to-screen unit. I was able to do 55 lines per inch on a 158 mesh. I did lose my 1 to 10% dots, maybe 13-14% dots. But I was able to do that because it's a wax and it's got incredibly high D max value, meaning it's going to stop light really well. But again, because it's such a thick stencil, there's that height. When the light hits it using LED light, when the light hits it, the light comes up around that dot that's right there and it's going to undercut it. So the thicker your stencil, the more that light can undercut what's there. Where LED lights, you know, UV lights are more like wavelengths like this. LED lights are coming in a little bit sharper angle, and single point light sources come almost straight up. So if I had a single point light source that I was using, I would have been able to keep more dots because it's the LED, the light comes in and hits it and then clips it because it's such a thick stencil. If my stencil was thinner, I would have been able to resolve all my dots because of the distance that the light travels at that angle, the cone that it gives you, it won't undercut. Anyways, deeper detail on exposing a screen, thick stencils, 158 mesh. You can see that the back of the screen is absolutely glossy. There's that much emulsion down. And then my 305 is just a 1-in-1 coat, standard 305 high mesh printing, high detail. There's not as big of a hang up on your mesh count when doing puff as there is on your control, your ink deposit, and how you can manipulate your mesh to get a thicker stencil. So again, a 110, very standard, very normal. still do amazing detail. I was able to do 40 line on a 110 mesh, which gave me some great detail. I just wanted to geek out a little more and throw in higher detail levels. And again, this is something that, you know, if we choose to go forward with this for our open house, you can come by and you can pull the squeegee and check it out. To recap, we are using a thick stencil for our puff. We're using a soft squeegee to print that puff so that we can ensure a thicker deposit of ink. Remember, thicker deposit of ink and a high percentage of puff will give you a really high puff, as you can see in this print. And then I'm using a top color for the black to give me grayscale value on this and to help with creating depth and dimension. Now, the one thing I hadn't talked about yet was the percentage of puff that I put into this ink. When we originally launched the FN Low Cure Puff, we had talked about not going above 20%. Well, this is a little more than 20%. I'm at around 30–35% puff. But I'm able to do that because I've added stretch. I added the FN stretch to this ink. Now, it doesn't have to be FN stretch, it can be anyone's stretch. But what we want is we want that ink, when the bubbles expand, we want to help that ink be able to stretch without breaking. So if I was to take this print and stretch and pull on it to see if the ink is durable enough to last through a wash cycle, I've got some respectable stretch out of it. I'm not getting any ink film split out of it, but I'm at a 30–35% puff load. And because of that stretch, that's giving it that extra pliability, that extra movement, so that this print doesn't break down. If you are going to do this in your shop, test, test, test. Do wash test. Do not just assume because Colin said, hey, I can go to 35% puff, that it's gonna work for you. The ink that I'm putting this into, this is Rio. I'm putting this into the Wilflex Rio. When I originally added it to the Rio, I did not get the stretch and the flexibility that I wanted. So I needed to add some stretch to it in order to get that flex that I wanted out of there, but still get a good loft out of the ink print with what I was doing. I wanted that dramatic amount of puff. Oh, the one thing I didn't go over was the shirt and how that shirt impacts how much puff you're actually going to see. So again, recapping, levers, amount of puff, thickness of deposit, but also how stiff your shirt is. If you're working with a heavyweight cotton shirt, that fabric is not going to want to move as much. If you're working with a really soft tri-blend or even 100% polyester, that puff is going to expand and that fabric is going to move with it really quickly. So even at 20% puff, if you print on a heavyweight cotton and then like a really lightweight tri-blend, you're going to have a dramatic difference in how that puff looks. The heavyweight cotton is going to puff a little bit, but the tri-blend is going to puff a lot. You're going to see a lot of puckering of the fabric. So I'm going to print my black as a foundation for this design because when I print the puff, you're going to see some dimensionality. That puff is going to have a fairly heavy deposit. And if I need to print my black again afterwards and get my 100% areas to drop on the t-shirt, that's going to be a bit of a challenge. If I print it first, now I have a foundation for all of that ink to touch on. And if I can't get it to drop, then I already have ink there on the shirt. So we can see a nice representation of the Mayan calendar. Again, this is at 55 lines per inch. And it is a little saturated, but I knew that once the puff hit it and expanded, this was going to lighten out really nice. So let's take a look at the puff with just a single stroke and what that looks like. Again, I'm using the 65, 90, 65 squeegee, and I'm doing a really good flood and holding it up pretty close to straight up. And now you can see where the puff is falling. We have these little shadow dots in here. We have them in all areas. We have a little bit. There's very, very little 100% solid. But in some of those areas, I did lose those dots because, well, I'm geeking out and trying to do far more on this mesh than I should be able to. So you can see the shadow areas and where we've got these little dots in here. those are gonna puff, but they're not going to puff with the same volume. They're not gonna pucker the fabric. And in these areas which are bigger, those are gonna pucker the fabric and cause that to lift up a little bit more and look like it has a lot more loft. So I'm going to lay down a slightly thicker deposit here. I'm gonna flood the screen again. At a 30 to 45 degree angle, light pressure, I'm gonna pull the squeegee. My screen is coming off right behind the squeegee. We got good off contact with this thick stencil. I'm gonna do this one more time. Lay down a lot of ink. There we go. Let's see what that looks like. Now, because of dot gain, you can see that we have a lot more ink coming down from that first squeegee pass. With this volume of ink that I have here, this is what's going to cause that print to really puff up. Now, it does look a little bit out of control, and that's a fair observation. There is definitely some stuff in here that might be a little bit too much. But this is just to show you what it can be and what it can look like and what your variables are. So I'm going to give this a good flash. Again, I'm working with a cold platen, so it's going to be a little challenging to get an even heat distribution. But again, we don't want to get it so hot that you actually see the print start to dull out, which means that the puff is activating. Now, because I have some stretch in here, that stretch causes a little bit of a shine, a little bit of a gloss. Okay, so I have a little bit of tack here. Maybe just a smidgen too much, but I've got no ink coming off in my hand. And you can see that regardless of what I'm doing to control it, there is still just a little bit of activation, and there is quite a bit of dimension that's happening here. I'm gonna give this another quick flash, let that cool down just a little bit, come back with the black. Now I'm not gonna flood my black because I'm not trying to get that black ink to drop past all these deep edges that you see here. You know, trying to get black to fall into these little crevices here, it's definitely gonna be troublesome to get a good black deposit. And again, to reinforce, that's why I printed it first, so that there's already black there to give us that depth. Okay. And there we go. We can see in some of these areas that I did not quite get that black ink to drop down. And that's okay. Yep, they're still hanging up in the screen a little bit. But that's why I printed it first. And again, it looks very dark until it goes through the dryer to actually puff. So these areas in here where we have all that halftone detail, once that starts to puff, that's going to lighten out dramatically. All right, let's take a look. As you can see, there is quite a bit of puff going on. I'm gonna turn this inside out real quick. This is what the inside of the shirt looks like when you do a puff print. The puff expands and causes the shirt to pucker. Now here in the middle, there's a lot of structural stability just from the print around it. On the outside, it doesn't have that. So this edge can actually pull in a lot of that fabric from the outside. So you can see the outside of your puff prints puckering the shirt a lot more, and as a result, puffing a lot more. So let's turn this back. That saturated print now looks that saturated print now looks normal. We've got a lot of great textural elements in here inside, and you can see here on this side we've got a big edge where the puff came up where it was solid, but all those little dots, now it looks like weathered stone inside of it. But all those little spots are giving us, I mean, that's cracked stone. That looks great. Now I got a little bit too much in here, it looks like, but you know, now we're splitting hairs on something that I was playing with and experimenting with and having fun. But this is puff. This is 35% puff with FN stretch into a Willflex Rio mixing system color. printed through a 158 thin thread, and you saw the heavier deposit of ink, so that we could create this massive amount of puff with texture and detail in here. So that was a deep dive on doing interesting things with puff, creating dimensionality and creating a three-dimensional look with just 2 screens. If you liked what you see, leave a comment below. And I want to say thanks to all of you who have been commenting and creating a dialogue with it. It's really appreciated. Hope to see you guys in the comments again. If you have a concept for a deep dive, throw it in there. If you've been watching these, you've seen that conversation flow. Start your own. I'd love to talk to you. See you guys in the next one.